Good morning, and thank you for being here. Thank you especially to the organisers and volunteers who have put this event together, which is running so smoothly that you don't even realise that somebody's put it together. And of course, thanks for the invitation to speak here. It's my second Write the Docs, and it's a really enjoyable conference. I've got a lot out of this one already, and I'm sure there'll be more. This talk is a little bit mistitled, really, because what nobody tells about documentation, it should maybe more honestly be called what Daniele hasn't stopped telling you about documentation, because it seems that I've done rather a lot of that this year. And actually I was fooling around with the title, and I was thinking about titles, and I was thinking about the Woody Allen film, everything you wanted to know about sex but were afraid to ask, and I rejected this. It was just a bit too cutesy. But while I was idly playing with this, I was looking for the film poster of the Woody Allen film, Everything You Wanted to Know About Sex But Were Afraid to Ask, which is with Gene Wilder. I'm sure you've probably seen it. I wanted to doctor the film poster, so I did a web search. And then, to my horror, I realized that what I'd actually typed in was this. Everything You Were Afraid to Know About Sex, and I thought that was just one Freudian slip too far. So I'm glad that happened in private and nobody else saw what had come out of my mind, so we'll skip over that. I'll tell you about me. That's me. I work for DVO. We are a Django services company, or for providing services for people who want to deploy Django websites, and there I'm the community and documentation manager. I'm also a Python Django programmer and a member of the Django core development team and a member of the Django Software Foundation board. And Django is something that's really important to me because my career as a programmer is basically the same as my time with Django. Django's where I started. And although I am a programmer, I'm not on Django's core team because I'm a very good programmer. I don't have very much in the way of effective programming skills, and as a programmer, I rapidly find myself out of my depth, and I'm, by some significant margin, the least expert programmer on the team. So, as much as I would like to be, I'm never going to be a very good programmer, and that often grieves me. But what I contributed to Django, and my reason for being a part of the core team, is documentation. In other words, in Django, documentation has been and still is considered a core concern of the project and is valued as a useful activity. And this is an attitude that isn't always evident in software development, but it says quite a lot about Django's culture, and I value it a great deal, especially because I came to Django as a non-programmer, as an outsider. And it's not an exaggeration to say that I literally have a career because of Django's attitude towards documentation. So Django, both as a project and as a community, is important to me. Documentation's important to me. People who care about documentation, cultures, the communities that care about documentation, care about communicating, and that entails consideration of others. And that gives things like Django and this conference and the communities that surround them an additional human dimension. The other thing that I'm very much involved in that's very important to me is the project to develop programming communities in Africa through the Python communities. So I've been involved in a number of the initiation of a number of African Python conferences, first in 2015 in Namibia, from which grew the first PyCon Zimbabwe, which has happened for the second time this year, and then in just a few days will be the first PyCon Nigeria. So there's also a Python Africa website. I encourage you to go look at that. And if you're at all interested in traveling to Africa, as somebody who's involved in technology, there are opportunities to become involved in Africa, not just as a tourist or as a visitor, but as somebody who's collaborating and working with people working in technology in Africa, which is an opportunity that few people will enjoy. So if you go to conferences and do this kind of thing and are interested in visiting Africa, put the two things together, because you might have one of the most memorable, enduring experiences of your life. And we should move on to the talk. So, I'm not telling you anything you don't know already, that better documentation will make your project or your team or your product, whatever it is, more successful. When it comes to, I'm mainly talking about software, but some of what I'm talking about can apply to other kinds of documentation. When you share your software with the world, you want the world to use it. But many projects and authors fall foul of a very simple principle that it doesn't matter how good your software is, because if the documentation is not up to scratch, the world is not going to use your documentation. So if the documentation is missing or is just not good enough, the world will decide that your project is just too much trouble to get to grips with, and will find something else to solve its problems with. And you can't force people to use your software. Maybe if they're your employees, you might make them do it reluctantly and begrudgingly for a short while, but even that doesn't work. Your colleagues and your staff, never mind your users who have a free choice, without good documentation, won't use it effectively or won't use it at all. And this is particularly a problem that besets software projects. I'm sure that as those of you who are technical writers are probably working on projects where documentation has a much higher status than it does in some software projects and cultures. Although that's changing. And certainly I think that most people, even in the software world, where they've come to this a little bit late, most people try to create good documentation. Most people know that they need good documentation, and most try to create it, and most of them fail. And it's rarely because they're not trying hard enough. It's usually because they're just not doing it in the right way. So what I want to explain in this talk is how you can make your documentation better, not by working harder at writing documentation, but by doing it in the right way. The bad news is that you're probably doing it wrong. But the good news is that the right way is actually much easier. It's easier to write and easier to maintain. And there are some very simple principles behind this that rarely, if ever, get spelled out. And they seem to be secrets, though of course they shouldn't be. I shouldn't call them secrets, they're the keys. Anyway, I want to spell them out so that they stop being secrets. I think that literally this talk could make your project, especially if you're an open source, maintainer of an open source project, if you can put these principles into practice, it will make your documentation better and your project or product or team more successful. And the secret is this, that there isn't just one thing called documentation. There are exactly 4. And they represent 4 very clear and distinct purposes or functions. And these are those. Tutorials, how-to guides, reference material, and explanation. And documentation for software needs to include and be explicitly structured around these 4 different functions, each of which has a different purpose and requires a completely different mode of writing. At different times, people who are working with software need each of these 4 different kinds of documentation at different times, in different circumstances. So they're usually all necessary, and they need to be kept separate and distinct from each other, because that is the key to making documentation work and making it easy to maintain. A structure like this, or this structure rather, makes it obvious both to the author and the reader what information goes where. It tells the author how to write and what to write and where to write it. It saves the author from wasting a lot of time trying to wrestle the information that they're working with into a shape that makes sense, because here, each part of the structure has one and only one very clear job. So, we'll start with tutorials. Tutorials are lessons given by a teacher that take the reader by the hand through a series of steps to complete a project or meaningful exercise of some kind. They're what your project needs to show the beginner that they can achieve something with it. And their main purpose is to give the beginner the best possible start with your software. Tutorials are oriented towards the user's learning. They're learning oriented. So, I don't know if anyone here has taught a young child to cook. Has anyone done that? Yeah. It's messy and they have short attention spans, yeah? So, this is the way tutorials work. What you teach the child to cook actually doesn't matter that much. What's important is that the child finds it enjoyable, gains confidence, and then wants to come back to it again. And it's through the things the child does that it will learn what's important about cooking, including many of the things that you take for granted, like that you wash your hands before touching food, for example. And when we learn a new craft or skill, we always begin learning it by doing it. And using software, just like cooking, is a matter of skill or craft. It's knowledge, but it's not theoretical knowledge, it's practical knowledge. For some reason, I became a school teacher some years ago, and it wasn't a wholly successful experience either for me or my pupils. But one really important thing that I learned from that was that when it comes to teaching, what you teach people is almost irrelevant. What matters for their learning is what you get them to do. And that's the case both with teaching a child to cook and in tutorials. So the point of the tutorial is to get your learner started on their journey, not to take them to the final destination. You have to inspire their confidence in themselves, in the system that you're teaching them about, and in you as a teacher. So what you're asking them to do must work. And it must work every time, for as many people as possible in different circumstances. It must be repeatable. Learning only works when there's a sense, or learning of this kind, practical learning, only works when there is an immediate sense of achievement. So everything the learner does, every single thing a learner does, should accomplish something comprehensible and meaningful, however small it is. Tutorials need to be concrete, built around specific, particular outcomes and actions. Because in this kind of learning, it proceeds from the particular and the concrete to the general and the abstract, and not from the general and the abstract to the particular. So you get them to do specific things and then allow them to learn later about the general principles, which will just come as part of their learning. You don't have to teach them those general principles. In the tutorial, you don't explain anything that the learner doesn't need to know right now. And you don't want to distract your learner with options or choices or alternatives, because you're the teacher and you have responsibility for them. It's not up to them to choose what to learn. you are responsible for devising the whole program of learning, which is quite a responsibility. Anyway, the important thing is that having done the tutorial, the learner is now in a position to start making sense of the rest of the documentation and the software itself. And most software projects have bad, poor, or non-existent tutorials. Tutorials are what will turn a learner into a user, and a bad or missing tutorial will prevent your project from acquiring new users. So have a look at your tutorials and ask, what are they doing? If your tutorial is providing your new users with information, they're doing the wrong thing. They're not being tutorials. Your tutorial should be getting your user to take actions and to build up this kind of practical confidence with the material at hand. They're the hardest thing to write and maintain. A tutorial requires a teacher, almost like a physical presence. And the fact that in software documentation we have to include tutorials in the documentation means that it's automatically second best, because really there should be a teacher present in the room with them and able to respond to them. So we're asking a great deal of tutorial documentation. No wonder it's hard, just because the documentation isn't the best form for a tutorial, but often it's all we have. How-to guides are the next square in the quadrant. They take the reader through the steps required to solve a specific real-world problem. They're like recipes, directions to achieve a specific end. You know, how to create a web form, how to plot a three-dimensional data set, or how to enable LDAP. And they're task or problem-oriented, they're goal-oriented. And if you want another food analogy, then think about literally a recipe for preparing something to eat. It has a clear, defined end. It addresses a specific question, you know, how do I make this thing? Or what can I make with these ingredients? And they are completely distinct from tutorials. A how-to guide is an answer to a question that a real beginner probably wouldn't even be able to formulate properly. In the tutorial, you're the teacher and you know what the problems are that the beginner must encounter in order to learn. In the how-to guide, the user knows what the problem is and what they're trying to solve, and you've got the answer for them. How-to guides, unlike tutorials, tend to be done pretty well in software documentation because they're fun and they're easy to write. Again, they have their characteristics and their needs. How-to guides must contain a list of steps that have to be followed in order, just like tutorials, in fact, that have a reasonable starting point and a reasonable ending point, although they don't have to have this complete arc, this complete storyline that a tutorial does. They need to be reliable, but they don't need to be as bulletproof as a tutorial does. So, for example, a how-to guide can assume basic competence on the part of the user. They're intended to guide and not to teach. How-to guides must focus on a practical goal and what the user needs to do to get there. Anything else is a distraction. It must address a specific question. How do I do such and such? A how-to guide shouldn't explain anything, because explanations get in the way of action. They get in the way of the goal. How-to guides also need to have a little bit of built-in flexibility, unlike tutorials, so that the user can see how to apply the steps maybe to a slightly different context or example. In a how-to guide, practical usability is much more important than completeness, so you don't have to cover every single detail or every single option. I think that one of the most common mistakes in software documentation is to conflate how-to guides and tutorials. And you'll see them mashed up together. And they make neither very good tutorials nor how-to guides. Reference guides are technical descriptions of the machinery and its operation. They have only one job, which is to describe their code determined in software documentation, because that's what ultimately they describe. Key classes, functions, APIs, a Django is a Python class. This is how you create a model, and so on. They are information-oriented. And they should just list things that exist, like classes, functions, fields, models. By all means, you can use examples to illustrate usage, but it's not the place for explaining basic concepts or how to achieve common tasks. It should just be austere, to the point, and give the reader the facts. So if you want another analogy, an encyclopedia article about an ingredient, it just gives you the facts about the ingredient. In your reference documentation, your documentation structure should mirror the structure of the domain itself. So in software, it should mirror the structure of the code base, so that the user can navigate the code and the documentation at the same time. You need consistency, just like in a dictionary or an encyclopedia. They have very consistent formatting of structure and tone and format. Just one job: to describe, to give technical descriptions. And finally, of course, it has to be accurate and up to date, because any discrepancy is going to lead the user astray. For some software developers, this is the only kind of documentation they can really imagine is what they think documentation is. Yeah. And finally, we have explanation, which are discussions that illuminate or clarify a particular topic, and they're oriented towards the understanding. They're a chance to step back from the machinery and take a wider view. And for another analogy, I don't know if you know this book, Harold McGee on Food and Cooking. It provides historical, sociological, scientific, and other kind of background discussion of food and cooking in the kitchen. Explanation is the place for background and content. They explain why things are so. They offer alternative perspectives and alternative ways of considering things. They make connections and join up things to help the user make more sense of the subject and see how it stands in relation to other things. But they're not the place for instruction or for technical description. And they're not always so easy to write, because you're often starting with a blank page. It's not like when you're writing a how-to guide, you know exactly what the end point is. Anyway, here we are, the 4 quadrants of this scheme. And as soon as the characteristics of one part start appearing in the other, the quality of the documentation overall will fall. And if that's happening, then adding more material to the documentation is not going to make better documentation. It's just going to make more complicated and worse documentation. Less useful for the reader and harder for the author to maintain. And it starts to look like that. Or in fact, it starts to look like that, because people just want to forget about it and ignore it and hope that it will be somebody else's problem. So it's really hard to stop that from happening. It's very hard to keep them apart. And it's not, if you're a documentation writer, your fault. It's caused by 2 things. One is that in software documentation, we tend to keep all of these 4 things in the same repository, in the same form, using the same tools, delivering them in the same way, often produced by the same person as well. So the natural barriers that should exist between them are compromised. And also there are internal tensions in the structure that draw them together in this way. So here they are, neatly in their own quadrant. But if you look at them more closely, you'll see that tutorials and how-to guides are both concerned with describing practical steps, whereas how-to guides and reference material are what we need by our hands when we're actually doing the work, when we're coding. And explanations and reference guides are similar because they're both concerned with theoretical rather than practical knowledge. And explanations have something in common with tutorials because they make more sense when we're studying rather than we're actually at work. So you've got these internal tensions, and it's no wonder that it ends up looking like that. But that's what it should look like. And when you do have that, then you've got documentation that works, that's easy to maintain and write, that's easier to use and find your way around in. And it won't write itself, because it never does, unfortunately, but at least you have a clearer idea of where everything goes. And your users will be served better, because for all the different phases in the cycle of their interaction with your software, they will find the right kind of documentation that serves the needs of the moment. And we find this in various places. It exists in Django's documentation. Now I said this needs to be spelled out explicitly, so it was in Django's documentation, but I added that part that explains that it has to actually it actually says that explicitly. So we've got tutorials, topic guides, they are explanations, reference guides, and how-tos. Django CMS that I'm also involved in, the 4 sections, key topics being explanations. And seeing other people adopt this as well. So this is from a mathematical library, and here they call explanations, they call them discussions, but they are the same thing. Now, as a programmer, I work with things that crash all the time, and that's considered acceptable and fairly normal. But as an airline passenger, I have a very different attitude towards crashing. And it's quite a meaningful question to ask. Why do programs crash so much more than airplanes? Well, there are kind of obvious reasons that, an airplane tends to crash once, along with its passengers and crew. Whereas, when your program crashes, mostly nobody gives a shit, and you just start it again, and then it crashes again. But the main reason that planes rarely crash is that pilots do nearly everything properly, unlike programmers. They communicate properly, they troubleshoot properly, they follow instructions properly, and there's a lot that programmers can learn from pilots. Pilots even dress better. And lo and behold, we see in the world of piloting that the separation of functions represented in good documentation is observed very strictly, and it would be unthinkable for them to collapse into one another. So here we are again in the tutorial, by the way, with, as you can see on the right-hand side, with the teacher doing the practical, meaningful steps towards one complete project, however small. The how-to guides are the form of the checklists that the pilots follow every time they do absolutely anything, even if they've done it 6 times that day already. The reference guides that provide information and nothing else. And the explanations that you can sit back and go through to expand theoretical knowledge and put it into a wider context to cement it in the understanding. But I was looking for a picture on the internet for shockwaves. This is a shockwave in aerodynamics, and the 5th result I found was my own photograph. So that's it's a shockwave over the wing of a 767, where the airflow suddenly stops being supersonic and becomes subsonic. So you can see the diffraction. It looks like a crease in the wing. So look out over it on a sunny day, you can see it. Anyway, there they are. The ones that we need with us when we're flying, and the ones we want when we're studying. The ones that are concerned with practical steps, and the ones that are concerned with theoretical knowledge. There they are. That's my scheme. If you want to take a photograph of that, take it out. So, but also, you can... I'll wait for you to put your photographs. I'll put it up again in a minute if you don't get a good shot. It's also on our weblog, so you can read it at your leisure. And I think I'm pretty much out of time. I've got maybe 2 minutes left. That's me. I work at Divio. If you want to talk to me about Django or about Dockerizing Django deployments or documentation or Python in Africa, which is not mentioned there, come and talk to me or email me. I'm on IRC and GitHub and Twitter. Actually, I don't really use Twitter. It's, I think, the most hideous form of communication ever invented. So, maybe if they invented a service where you could send messages on other people's human skin, that would be worse. But until then, Twitter is the worst thing we have. So actually, just come and talk to me like a normal person. There's the link again, and there's the photograph again. Thank you very much.